Hello and welcome to another Josh Plays 40k painting tutorial. Today I will be painting a Neurogaunt from the Tyranid range. This is a sort of series of models that came out with the recent Leviathan box set, and I think are yet to be released individually. I know there has been a release with the codex of several of the models from the Leviathan set, but I don't think these were among them just yet. But they come in squads of 11, and then you have sort of 10 of these sized ones and then one slightly larger one with an exposed brain. But for this particular tutorial we're going to go for the majority and show you how to paint up one of the smaller ones, and hopefully you'll enjoy and take something away. So let's grab some brushes and get started. So the first thing we've done is undercoat the model with Wraithbone spray. This gives us a nice warm undertone. And first paint we're going to apply after that is Leviathan purple, and this is just over the carapace and hard shell areas of the model, of which this particular one has quite little of. So it's a good one to get out of the way and to get sorted. So for this I'm going to use a small layer brush just to keep the control over the paint. I don't want to be sort of flooding the model with this particular colour, just simply because there is so little of it. And we're going to be focusing on all the areas that are going to be hard shell. So like the top part here sort of goes in and down and across here. We obviously want to ignore this part of the shell and the skin because we'll be coming in with a different colour for that later. But just sort of focus your way around these top parts here, and the part that goes over the top of the head, and then not forgetting the crest on the nose. So do take your time, work your way around the miniature, obviously not forgetting the other side as well. And once you have completed all of these shell parts, if you make any mistakes, it is worth having a pot of Wraithbone to hand as well. I know I certainly have. This paint does have a habit of hitting places you don't always want it to go, but if you've got a pot of Wraithbone on standby, then you can fix up later. That's why we do these darker colours first, so they're easier to fix and we don't risk ruining any of the nice lighter shades that we do later on. So work your way around, and then when you're ready we can move on to the next stage. Once you're happy with that Leviathan purple, the next colour we're going to move on to is Caribou Crimson shade. Now, you might wonder why we're going to be using a shade as a base colour, but that is because it already has a really nice sort of strong pink tone to it, which isn't quite so strong and sticking as a way as using a contrast paint, because this will still give you some translucent qualities underneath, giving you a nicer, brighter finish using that Wraithbone. So we're going to be applying this over the lighter parts of the carapace, which obviously you may notice from the box art. This model particularly has different tones to it, rather than just sort of straight up purple and then skin. So I'm again sticking with a smaller brush and just going to be picking out those areas. So for instance, sort of around the bottom here, and I am being careful not to get this onto the skin, as that will be a different shade of a sort of pinky tone. But just sort of working way around. Again, we don't want it pooling too much either. It's good to get the tone and some shading in there as well, as that will obviously help give it a bit more depth. But we don't want it sort of drowning over the tops of this extra armour. So there's a few areas to pick out. So there's the part sort of directly underneath the purple, and then there's the sort of tops of the kneecaps here, which, as I say, would typically be a more richer and vibrant purple, like the Leviathan purple, for instance. But in this case, as I say, we want it to be slightly lighter, and then not forgetting either the armouring over the top of the tail here. So work your way around, let that fully dry before moving on to the next stage, as the next part we'll be moving on to is shading of the skin, and we will want this armour to be completely dry before we look to apply anything over the top of that. Once you're happy with how that Carabao Crimson has come out, the next thing we're going to do is move on to shading the skin of the miniature. And for this, we're going to be using a contrast medium mix with Magos Purple. And for that, we're looking at a sort of 3 to 4 parts contrast medium to 1 part Magos Purple, and this sort of just dilutes it down quite nicely, so you've got a good sort of shading over the skin, giving it that more sort of purpley alien feel, while still retaining the light undercoat underneath. So we're just sort of starting to apply that over. This is not looking to have any sort of great manners of pooling here or anything like that. We just want a nice sort of smooth coverage to obviously tint the skin away from where it is. Obviously we do want it in the recesses as well, again to obviously bring out some further definition, and then sort of going from there. So what we'll also be looking to do with this mixture while we've got it is shading over what we have just done with the Carabao Crimson, just to give it a slightly different hue as well. This just helps obviously break up the pink and just sort of give it a bit more depth as well. So sort of put that over the top of the pink areas that we've just done, and let that dry. Again, as I say, we're not looking to go over too heavy, just to obviously apply a light shading. So once you've worked your way around the miniature and allowed it to dry, this will probably take the longest amount of time for that to happen. When you're happy with that skin shade, the next thing we're going to do is move on to Guilliman Flesh, and again I'm sticking with a small airbrush for this, and this is to pick out the sort of smaller, more exposed sort of skin and under muscle tone parts. There aren't too many of these, but particularly on the backs of the legs here. Now normally, if you've seen some of my other Tyranid tutorials, I would do these in a more sort of vibrant sort of pink, like Volupus pink for instance, but because these models have a slightly different sort of colour tone to them than the rest of the Tyranids, obviously aside from having the main purple at one end, they don't follow too many resemblances to the actual other paint schemes of the miniature. So I'm just going to sort of stick along those lines and make these a bit more sort of fleshy coloured, and sort of going with the Guilliman Flesh is a nice sort of mid-tone to that. So there aren't too many areas, but there's these little bits in here on the backs of the legs as well, so just take your time, work your way around. Obviously try not to get it onto the flesh that we've already shaded, and then allow that to dry before moving on. It is quite important that everything is completely dry before we move on, because we're going to be doing some highlighting next, and for this we're going to be using a dry brush method, so we definitely want all the areas to be nice and dry. Once you're happy and got all those shades dry, we're going to move on to highlighting up that sort of pinky carapace that we've done, and for this we're going to be using Full Grim Pink, but we're going to be using this as a small dry brush, and we're very lightly just going to sort of run the dry brush over the top of that, just to pick out the sort of raised edges of that. Be careful not to get it on the sort of darker purple. As I say, we are just looking to generate just a little bit of edge highlighting on here, and pick out the sharpest points on there as well. If you use a small dry brush as I am here, I'm using the miniature dry brush from the Army Painter range, and you should be able to pick out those as well. The small dry brush from Games Workshop, for instance, would also give you the same finish. And then sticking again with that small dry brush, we're going to be doing a little bit of Wraithbone, and this is over the skin, just to sort of take and some of the sting out of the shade that we've put over it, and pale it back up again. When you sort of look at the box art for these chaps, you'll find that their skin is a lot paler than that of a sort of traditional Tyranid, where you normally get that sort of quite strong pinky sort of hue to it, whereas in this one it's a lot paler. So again, to achieve this quite nicely and sort of evenly over, I find the dry brush sort of method and technique will really help pick out any of the sort of sharper edges. Now obviously you'll notice that we haven't done the claws yet, or some of the sort of finer detail, and that is because basically I didn't want to have to keep neatening it up after doing these dry brushes, as obviously they are likely to touch onto that. So that will be the next point we do. Next up, we're going to be looking at those claws and hoofs of the model, and for this we're going to be using Flesh Tearers Red. And as I say, this is just coming straight from the pot, and I'm using the back to the small layer brush to help sort of maintain the control that I'm looking for. And as I say, I'm sort of looking out to pick up any of the sort of claws of the model, so the talons on the front here, for instance, and obviously the main feet at the bottom here as well as the sort of claws on the back there. So there's not too much that needs to be coated with this, and you'll find it will dry quite quickly, and gives a sort of subtle highlighting straight away, which is obviously what you'd expect from the contrast paints, and obviously that will inevitably sort of speed up the process of what you're trying to achieve, obviously depending on whether you're trying to get a lot of these done in any one time. So sort of work your way around, pick out all those details with the red, and then wait for that to dry before moving on to the next step. Once you've applied that red, we can then move on to Skeleton Horde, and this is just to pick out the teeth of the miniatures. So they sort of have this sort of upper sort of tooth line, and this just sort of gives them a little bit of depth and colour in comparison to the rest of the sort of flesh around it. Once you've got that Skeleton Horde applied, we're going to move on to adding some highlights into that purple now. And for this we're going to be using Genestealer Purple, and you're going to want quite a small brush, if as small as you've got it. If the small layer brush, if you've got a nice fine point to it, will do this, but I'm using the Artist Opus 000 size, and we're going to be looking to do a little bit of feathering and edge highlighting on this. So it will mostly be edge highlighting, but for the example here of the nose rim, we're just going to be getting a few little lines just on the end, just to pick out and give it a little bit more depth, and some make it look as though it's got sort of different colours and that running through it. So that's that end part. And then we're going to just be picking out some edge highlighting as well, so the corners and tips of this purple here as well. And really you can add as much or as little highlighting as you want to, depending on sort of what sort of finish you're going for with the model. But work your way around, and obviously once you're comfortable with what you've got, then we can move on to the next stage. Well, once you're happy with that purple, we're going to move on to highlighting up the red. And the first colour we're going to be using for this is Wild Rider Red. And I'm sticking with the Artist Opus range, but I am increasing the size slightly to the 00, just as I don't need quite the sort of finest of points. And this brush will hold just that little bit more paint as well. And again, for this, similar to before, we're looking to pick out the edges of the claws. So we're just sort of working our way down the end there to obviously pick out the sharpest edges that we want the light to catch. So work your way around the miniature, and then once you're happy with the red, we can move on to the next colour. The final touch to the model is then just a little bit of Troll Slayer orange on the very sharpest tips of where the red is, where you want the red to stand out the strongest. So any sort of broad parts where the light would touch the model the most, you just want to put a little bit of this Troll Slayer orange in to really make that pop. And here we have a finished Neurogaunt. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please leave a like and or a comment below if you have any questions. I will come back to you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.